Hello and welcome. In this module, we will be reviewing the basic requirements of first aid. First off, we want to introduce you to the idea that there are vertical standards as well as horizontal standards when reviewing codes. For example, the ordinary basics of first aid will cover all industries. That is a horizontal standard. The vertical standard is a code that only applies to a specific type of industry. For example, construction. It abides by the horizontal standards of the basics. However, there are some areas that have stricter guidelines that only pertain to the construction industry. You may find these standards on OSHA's website, osha.gov. Your employer must make sure first aid supplies are readily available. First aid supplies at your workplace must be appropriate to your occupational setting and the response time of your emergency medical services. Just as accident prevention programs are tailored to a business, first aid kits should be tailored to the worksite. When your employer is doing the analysis of the types of hazards existing on the worksite, they should try to visualize the types of injuries that may occur. They may not need more than the basic first aid kit. However, your employer should also try to visualize other potential sources of injuries based on the type of equipment and chemicals used in the work environment. For instance, in an office environment, an employer may think that a paper cut is all they need to worry about. However, sometimes they need to look beyond the obvious. For instance, are the employees required to work with household cleaners? If they are, there's always the possibility of some of the cleaner splashing into the employee's eyes. The emergency eye wash station doesn't seem as far-fetched now, does it? When would you ever need burn ointment in an office setting? Your employer may say the only equipment that their employees use is a copy machine. Well, do the employees ever have to clear jams in that copy machine? The heating elements in a copy machine can get hot enough to cause burn injuries. Also, their office may have a coffee maker or a hot beverage vending machine where employees could get scalded. Oh, and let us not forget the type of weather the employees are exposed to, as that will also create certain hazards. The bottom line is that your employer must look at their worksite in the worst case scenario. Remember Murphy's Law when making an assessment. Whatever can go wrong, will go wrong. On an important note, first aid kits from your local retailer or safety supplier should be adequate for most non-industrial employers. Your employer will still want to check to be on the safe side. Make sure your employer's first aid supplies are easily accessible to all employees. The kit should be stored in containers that protect them from damage, deterioration, or contamination. Containers must be clearly marked, not locked, and may be sealed. It also must be able to be moved to the location of an injured or acutely ill employee. Providing first aid assistance and first aid supplies can help reduce the severity of an injury to reduce the cost of medical bills and the length of time an employee is unable to work. Training for first aid is offered by the American Heart Association, the American Red Cross, the National Safety Council, and other nationally recognized and private educational organizations. First aid courses should be individualized to the needs of the workplace. Some of the noted program elements may be optional for a particular plant or facility. On the other hand, unique conditions at a specific worksite may necessitate the addition of customized elements to a first aid training program. Emergency washing facilities or equipment, eye washes or emergency showers, are considered a form of first aid. Emergency eye washes are required where there is potential for worker eye exposure to corrosives, strong irritants, or toxic chemicals. If major portions of a worker's body would be exposed to these substances, an emergency shower is required. One important item to remember: if emergency washing facilities are needed, they must be located within 10 seconds travel time or less than 50 feet from the worker. Emergency washing equipment is required if employees are exposed to the following types of chemicals. Corrosives. They destroy living tissue. This includes acids and caustics. Includes chemicals with pH less than 2.5 or more than 11. Strong irritants. Strong irritants cause an inflammatory effect at the point of contact. Toxic chemicals are absorbed through the skin and cause ill health effects. Includes pesticides. All logging employees except truck drivers must have first aid training. The reason log truck drivers are not required to receive first aid and CPR training is they are not involved with falling, yarding, loading, or processing. If they are involved in these processes, then a first aid card and CPR training is a must. Each employee's first aid and CPR training and/or certificate of training must be current. At least 2 persons holding a valid certificate of first aid training must be present or available at all times in sorting yard operations. The employer must provide first aid kits at each worksite where trees are being cut, at each active landing or logging site, and in all transport vehicles, log trucks, speeders, and road graders used where there is an absence of readily accessible first aid supplies, first aid stations, and first aid rooms or their equivalent. Such vehicles and equipment must be equipped with not less than a 10-package first aid kit, and the number of first aid kits and content of each kit must reflect the degree of isolation, the number of employees, and the hazards reasonably anticipated at the worksite. Following is the minimally acceptable number and type of required first aid supplies to meet the requirements of this section. The contents of the first aid kit listed should be adequate for a small worksite of 2 to 3 employees. For larger or multiple logging operations conducted at the same location, the employer should provide additional first aid kits or additional quantities of supplies in the first aid kits. Transport vehicles, log trucks, speeders, and road graders must have at least the following number and types of first aid supplies. When 6 or more employees are generally being transported on any one trip, the first aid kit must be increased in size. The employer must maintain the contents of each first aid kit in a serviceable condition. Each employee, including supervisors, must receive or have received first aid and CPR training. New employees not holding a valid first aid card must be trained within a reasonable time, not to exceed 6 months from hiring. Now let's take a look at first aid requirements regarding construction, another vertical standard. Each employer must have available at all work sites where a crew is present a person or persons holding a valid first aid certificate. All crew leaders, supervisors, or persons in direct charge of 1 or more employees must have a valid first aid certificate. For the purpose of this section, a crew means a group of 2 or more employees working at any worksite. On a very important note, the requirement that all crew leaders, supervisors, or persons in direct charge of 1 or more employees applies even if other first aid trained persons are available. In emergencies, crew leaders will be permitted to work up to 30 days without having the required certificate, providing an employee in the crew or another crew leader in the immediate work area has the necessary certificate. All vehicles used to transport work crews must be equipped with first aid supplies. When practical, a poster must be fastened and maintained either on or in the cover of each first aid kit and at or near all phones plainly stating the worksite address or location and the phone numbers of the emergency medical responders for the worksite. Be aware that the same requirements are still in effect for emergency wash stations as indicated previously for this industry. First aid kits in vehicles or at company facilities must be placed in locations where they will be readily available when needed. 1910.151 Appendix A provides guidance on the first aid kit contents and how to assess the needs of the workplace, including exposure to blood-borne pathogens. Additionally, the contents of the first aid kit shall be placed in a weatherproof container with individual sealed packages for each type of item, and shall be checked by the employer before being sent out on each job and at least weekly on each job to ensure that the expended items are replaced. While the standard does not specifically cover documenting the results of the first aid kit inspections, some companies have initiated inspection documentation procedures in which staff inspect the contents of first aid kits at regular intervals and enter the inspection date and inspector's initials on an inspection tag inside the kit. Proper equipment for prompt transportation of the injured person to a physician or hospital or a communication system for contacting necessary ambulance service shall be provided. Your company's first aid program should be reviewed periodically to determine if it continues to address the needs of the specific workplace. Training, supplies, equipment, and first aid policies should be added or modified to account for changes in workplace safety and health hazards, worksite locations, and worker schedules since the last program review. The first aid training program should be kept up to date with current first aid techniques and knowledge. Outdated training and reference materials should be replaced or removed. Well, that's that. We covered the basic first aid requirements and also discussed the differences between a horizontal standard and a vertical standard. Thank you for your interest in occupational safety and health. We hope you find this information helpful. Once again, thank you.